I just want to make it clear that this was not my idea, and I apologize to everyone who has to sit through watching that one-handed backhand today. Nah, I'm just kidding. Honestly, my one-hander was better than I expected. I basically just went out there and drilled with each racket, and by the end of it, it was getting decent. Honestly, potentially better than my sometimes terrible two-handed backhand. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Hopefully you enjoyed that little intro. Honestly, making this video was a lot of fun. I know I've been delaying it for a while, but honestly, hitting one-handers just feels like a rite of passage in tennis, so thank you for continuously reminding me to get it done. It was definitely a struggle, especially at the beginning, because obviously I'll hit the occasional one-hander for fun when I go out for a normal hit, but I'm way more used to hitting a two-handed backhand. So please, do like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the fruit of my efforts. And also, of course, remember that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsrunners.ca. You can follow me in the store on Instagram and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. See, this video is proof that I really do listen to the suggestions in the comments, so please let me know. Now obviously, yes, this was a slightly different review process to what I'm used to because I don't just naturally hit great one-handed backhands over the course of a session. Instead of rallies, there's going to be a lot more footage of me drilling with the specific racket I'm talking about. That's the best way I found to really nitpick what made each racket particularly good for a one-hander. So we will get into specific frames here in a second, but first I just wanted to cover some of the common characteristics that stuck out to me as the most important in making rackets perform well on one-handed backhands. The number one most important characteristic I found with all these frames is that they are all extremely solid and stable. Stability is important on any shot, but it's particularly important for the one-hander because you can't generate the same amount of racket head speed as you can on your forehand, and you obviously don't have that second hand stabilizing the racket on your backhand. Coming across your body like this, it's harder to crush the ball, so you have to trust that the racket is going to do some of it for you, which is why it's so important that it stays rock solid on impact. Weight is the most efficient way to get stability and solidity out of a frame, which is why all of the rackets on this list weigh at least 310 grams static. Now the next thing I found very important was good maneuverability, and especially a sensation of whippiness from my racket, because that's how I was able to vary my shot selection. If you have a super slow racket, you'll get jammed during your swing and more or less be forced to just block the ball back into play rather than manipulate it in any way to hit a purposeful shot. In tennis, you always need at least the potential to hit with purpose on either wing, because otherwise you become one-dimensional and your opponent will target that. We see it even in the pros. One-handers get targeted incessantly because it's a tougher shot than a two-hander or a forehand, so it's very important to give yourself the best chance of succeeding with it, and more maneuverability will help with that. That whippy feel gives you more control over the racket face, which will help you generate more power with wrist lag, and especially more spin because you can brush up more easily at the top of your stroke. Now you're probably thinking, maneuverability and whippiness, you just said the racket has to be heavy, now you're saying it has to be maneuverable. Those two don't go together. That's not entirely true. A racket can be heavy and whippy as long as it has a small head size, a thin beam, and a headlight balance, which usually comes with a swing weight that isn't too high relative to the static weight. The biggest head size on this list is a 98. All the beams are fairly thin, and none of the strung swing weights are higher than 335, but before we get into the top 5, let's first talk about some honorable mentions. I want to talk about the Blade and CX200 because at first glance you think small head size, thin beam, they should be stable enough at 305 grams, plus just add a leather grip if you want them to be heavier, and sorry I don't have a blade with me today. These two rackets are definitely decent for one-handed backhands, but my main gripe with them is that they have a slightly mushy, artificially stable feel because of the stabilization tech going on inside their layups. This tech has gotten better over the years and it's good for a lot of things, but it adds a layer of ambiguity to the sweet spot, which is not something you want to feel when you're hitting a one-hander. I wanted the sweet spot to feel as responsive as possible because this is a stroke that requires so much precision that you need to trust that the ball is going to go where you tell it to if you make good contact. Stabilization tech takes away from pure ball feel and therefore precision, and it is more intrusive on these two frames than it is on the rest of the rackets on this list, which is why they didn't quite make the cut. I also quickly want to talk about 100 square inch rackets because like I said earlier, the biggest head size on this list is going to be a 98, so obviously none of them made the list. 100s like the Pure Drive, the Pure Aero, the Extreme, rackets like that I didn't include because they're not traditionally stable frames, and they also don't have that classic pure connection to the ball. So it was pretty obvious that I wasn't going to include rackets like that, but let's talk about the gravity and the speed because they do have constant beams and definitely more of that traditional feel. The issue with these two rackets, you can probably guess, is that they're just a little bit too sluggish to be up there with the best. Again, they're good, but to be in the top 5, you kind of have to have it all. The gravity I was close to including, and I think for the right player, the Pro could work, but you have to be okay sacrificing that whippiness, and I already explained that's extremely important, especially for spin. The Gravity MP I actually really did like for one-handers because it does feel solid, stable, and precise, especially for a racket that only weighs 295 grams, but it just wasn't as good as the rest of the rackets on this list. That's kind of harsh, but it is a reality. But anyways, that's enough with these honorable mentions. Let's finally get into this top 5, and I'm sorry it took so long to get here. Coming in at number 5, we have the Dunlop CX 200 Tour 1820. Now, right off the bat, 95 square inch head size, 20.5 millimeter beam, 310 millimeter balance, you get the idea. It perfectly slots into all the specs we mentioned earlier. Compared to the CX200, the smaller head size makes it more precise, and then of course the 18x20 string pattern makes it more solid and consistent, so you're not going to have that same ambiguity I mentioned with that racket. The other thing I love about this racket is that it's incredible for slicing. The slice is an extremely important stroke if you're going to play with a one-hander because it's how you can slow down the point if you can't generate a full stroke on your backhand. 1820s are generally the best for slicing because they have low launch angles so you can hit these super consistent piercing slices, and smaller head size are also good because you can kind of knife at the ball more efficiently. Now yes, the CX200 Tour has it all on paper, but the reason it's only 5th here is because it doesn't really have an X factor pushing it any higher. It's not super spin friendly, it's not particularly quick, and it's certainly not the most user-friendly or forgiving racket because it is a 95. It's just a really solid frame for a one-handed backhand, especially for those of you who like that traditional feel of small head-sized 1820s and don't really need any extra bells and whistles. We're going to move on to another 95 that most certainly does have those extra bells and whistles. Coming in at number 4, we have the Yonex VCORE 95. Now obviously it's a 95, so it has great precision and whippiness, but what sets it apart from the CX is that it has much better variety, especially if you want to add spin to your shot because of the unique beam design and the string pattern technology. It's the only non-constant beamed racket on this list, and the beam is designed to be more aerodynamic, which ends up making it even quicker than your average 95. It's probably the fastest 310 gram racket on the market right now, so you can easily generate a ton of racket head speed, and yet it's still super solid and consistent on contact. Maybe just add a little bit of weight at 3 and 9. Then you've got the more open 16x20 string pattern and all the spin tech like the silicone oil infused grommets, and you have again probably the most spin friendly 95 I've ever tested. You're obviously sacrificing a little bit of consistency because it deviates from that traditional design, but it's still a 95, and for a modern one-hander, spin is probably a little bit more important than that ultra-traditional feel of something like the CX200 Tour. Now the reason it's coming in 4th and not any higher on the list is because I'm still not the biggest fan of the feel on the VCOREs. I've talked enough about vibration dampening mesh, but it does mute the racket a little bit too much. Like I said, I want the best possible feel when I'm hitting a one-hander, and this doesn't quite have that. But again, this is the one that's made for a more modern style, and feel isn't as important for that. This is definitely the odd one out on this list, but I didn't want to leave it off because it shows that a racket can have modern elements but still be very good for one-handed backhands. Now, if the VCORE 95 gets knocked for not having the best feel, this one certainly doesn't. Coming in at number 3, we have the Head Prestige Pro. The Prestige has the best feel of any racket on this list. To me, it goes pretty clearly Prestige number 1, then the next 3, and then number 5 is the VCORE 95. Just in general, head rackets seem to have the most pure, old school feel right now, especially head rackets with a thin, constant beam like this. As soon as I hit a few good backhands, I got that awesome dopamine hit and started knowing exactly where to make contact in the string bed to repeat that sensation over and over again. It is funny because the Prestige technically has the biggest head size of any racket on this list, but I think it's up there with the CX200 Tour in terms of precision, and that's thanks to the 20mm beam and 18x20 string pattern, and of course the fantastic feel. It does suffer a bit of that overly traditional feel the CX200 Tour has because of these specs, but also the bigger head size does make it noticeably more forgiving. The fact that it achieves that more forgiving feel while maintaining precision and providing the best feel of any racket on this list means that it comes in a little higher for me. Now it is technically the slowest racket on this list because of the bigger head size and high static weight, but it still has such a thin beam and headlight balance that you'll never think this racket is slow, especially if you have a more classic style, which this complements perfectly. Honestly, picking between this racket and the Prestige for second was tough, and I really don't think you can go wrong with either, but I do think the Pro Staff 97 fits the bill for a one-hander just a little bit better. Before I started this process, I thought that the perfect racket for a one-handed backhand was going to be a constant beam 97 with a consistent 16x19 string pattern for variety and a fairly stiff flex for responsiveness. Basically basically the Pro Staff. Especially that stiffer point and shoot style of flex I thought would be important, because on a one-hander, you don't want the ball to lose too much energy during dwell time so that you can deflect power more efficiently. For a two-hander, because you have that second hand there for stability and control, you do feel like you can grab and place the ball a little bit easier, which is where that softness can really help. After my playtest, I don't think that stiffer flex is as important as I initially thought it would be, but I do still think it complements a one-hander just a little bit better because it is just slightly more responsive. That's kind of the main difference between the Prestige and the Pro Staff. The Prestige has that longer dwell time, more guidey type of control, and the Pro Staff has that more direct point and shoot control. So really pick your poison between these two. And on top of that, the Pro Staff does have a bit more variety than the Prestige, of course, because it has that 16x19 string pattern, so you can generate a little more spin. Other than that, it's about as classic as it gets. 97 square inch head size, 315 grams static weight, 21.5 millimeter beam. It's extremely solid, consistent, and stable, and achieves all that with very little intrusive technology, so it's just a fantastic racket for a one-handed backhand. But obviously, the Pro Staff 97 is great, but it's not the best. Coming in at number 1, we have the Yonex Percept 97. On paper, the Percept is very similar to the Pro Staff, 97 square inch head size, 16x19 string pattern, 21 millimeter beam, even a similar 64 RA unstrung flex. So really, take everything positive I just said about the Pro Staff and copy and paste it here. But what pushes this to be even a little bit better is that it does have that modern playability side to it. The Percept definitely has more tech and a less boxy, more modern beam design, so it's definitely more forgiving and it's more stable at a lower swing weight, which is why I think it's just a little bit better. I was consistently able to generate more racket head speed so I could get a little bit more power and spin on my one-hander, and the sweet spot feels more like it does on a 98 than a 97, so I didn't have to be as perfectly on top of my game with it. Now yes, you do make a tiny sacrifice in feel compared to the Pro Staff or even the CX 200 Tour, but the stabilization tech in here is not nearly as intrusive as on the 98s I mentioned earlier. It really is a joy to hit with this thing, when you can combine good feel, consistency, user-friendliness, and variety all in one racket. You have a recipe for success, and that's how I feel when I'm hitting one-handers with this thing. Honestly, I'm thinking there might be a new racket journey video in the not-so-distant future, so stay tuned for that. Now, I am talking about the 310-gram Percept 97 here, but I do just want to mention the 330. Now, I wouldn't personally use it myself, but if you do want more stability and you're okay sacrificing maneuverability to get it, that would also be a solid option. But anyways, those are the top 5 best rackets for one-handers. I am going to end the video here because it's gotten way too long, but the key takeaway is just go for any racket that has that good combination of stability and maneuverability. Between these 5, they're all really solid, and I've just tried to illustrate why one might fit a playstyle better than the other, but don't see the Prestige at 3 and the Pro Staff at 2 and think that's going to be the same experience for everybody. They all offer something different, and figuring out which different applies better to you is how you should pick a racket from this list. Or not from this list, who knows, maybe the Extreme Power is the perfect racket for you. But anyways, with that said, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of these rackets, you can come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.